Hello, my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors. The most destructive thing ever invented by humans are the weapons that rain down from the skies, either freefall or by missiles. In just 34 years, from 1911 to 1945, technology went from a very basic flying machine, the Henrik Traub monoplane, flown by Italian Lieutenant Gavotti, dropping basically glorified hand grenades in the Italian Turkish War of 1911, the first recognised bombing mission, hardly capable of going faster than a small car of the period, and maybe no more than 3,000 foot of altitude, to a fully pressurised B-29 Superfortress with early computer-controlled guns capable of over 350 miles an hour at over 30,000 feet, with a range of over 3,000 miles, carrying a weapon capable of delivering the equivalent of 15,000 tons of explosive charges. The Henrik Traub monoplane, with a top speed of just 74 miles per hour, even the 1911 Vauxhall Prince Henry, the first recognised sports car, could do 70 miles an hour. So, welcome to the history of strategic aerial bombing. We'll be mainly looking at the strategic bombing during the Second World War, and again, mainly from the Allied perspective. But we will cover, briefly, the bomber in World War I and the 1930s bomber Mafia, plus the destructive raids of the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese bombing of China, plus the bombing in the early part of World War II. Strategic aerial bombing was the most controversial aspect of World War II from the Allied side, with bitter arguments between the Allies on how this was to be achieved. From the terrible losses by the Royal Air Force in the early years of the war, to the rise of Air Marshal Harris, Bomber Harris, to the arrival of the 8th Air Force of the United States Army Air Forces in 1942, with their bombing into a pittle barrel from 30,000 feet statements. It is often stated that the Royal Air Force did area bombing with precision, and the United States Army Air Force, well, they did precision bombing on a wide area. When you have 1,000 B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberators in the sky at the same time in mass formation, there is no way you are going to hit the target without what they say collateral damage. We shall also look at the development of the first atomic weapons and their dropping towards the end of the Second World War. But prior to this, the mass B-29 raids over Japan that killed possibly 5 times more than the 2 combined atomic bombs. This was based on Air Marshal Harris's or Bomber Harris's area tactics of night using incendiaries by the true monster of bombing, General Curtis LeMay. We shall also look at the most destructive bombing campaign in history as far as bombing victims go. That is the forgotten bombing campaign over North Korea during the Korean War. Under General Curtis LeMay's supervision, 20% of every North Korean was killed from 1950 to 53, potentially killing upwards of 2 million. That's more than all the previous bombing campaigns in World War I, the 1930s, World War II, Allied bombing over Germany and Japan. Yes, it is hardly ever mentioned, but the misinformation about the night over Dresden in February 1945 keeps being regurgitated, with claims of hundreds of thousands killed, when the truth was possibly the lower end of 10, the upper end of 20,000. We shall look at this in more detail, why this was. Finally, we shall look at the modern period from the 1960s onwards, such as the nuclear deterrent and the bombing campaign over Vietnam, and finally, the potential rise of indiscriminate bombing once again. Even though we talked about the rising technology that took us from the first bombing raid in 1911 to the dropping of the first atomic bomb in 1945, in just 34 years, the Great War saw aircraft go from very basic machines to the huge Hadley Page 400 and V1500s, capable of going from the UK to Berlin on bombing missions in just 4 years. But it was the German airships that first caused mass panic in the United Kingdom as early as January 1915, after some nuisance raid by German seaplanes in 1914. In 1908, H.G. Wells wrote War in the Air, which depicted aerial bombing and destruction of cities from the air, which was widely read And the early bombing by the Germans over the UK caused mass panic amongst the politicians and the population. The first successful raid by Zeppelins took place in early 1915, targeting generally the UK coastal towns and ports. Targets from the Humber to Great Yarmouth, Sheringham and King's Lynn, killing about only 4 people, injuring about 16, with some property damage. The RNAS, Royal Naval Air Service, could only put up a limited response, and early attempts to shoot them down failed. In fact, the very first airship was destroyed by bombing, and later on incendiary bullets were developed, and the use of more effective fighters soon started to take their toll of these German airships. The campaigns by the Zeppelins lasted until 1917, when there were about 50 major raids carried out by around about 100 massive Zeppelins, killing, in the end, over 500, injuring over 1,500. But at least 30 were destroyed by UK air defences. By 1917, the Germans sending over Gotha bombers and the larger Strachan bombers had caused more damage and killed almost 900 and injured over 2,000. But it also resulted in the loss of 60 of these bomber aircraft, as the UK had organised, coordinated an air defence system that was very effective. The system included reporting stations, phone systems, wireless communications, anti-aircraft guns, searchlights and fighter aircraft. It actually would be the basis of the later Dowding system in the Battle of Britain, which had the benefit of radar and better communications. But the system was basically the same. The clue to how difficult strategic aerial bombing would be was all there to see in the bombing of World War I. Weather, range, freezing conditions for the crew, losses to anti-aircraft defences, and more importantly, finding the target. But the folks at the top were convinced that this was the future of warfare. In April 1918, the Royal Air Force was formed on advice and reports from Jan Smuts, but soon realised the need for a separate bombing formation. And in June 1918, an early form of bomber command came into being, the Independent Air Force. The IAF was commanded by Hugh Trenchard. It flew light bombers such as DH-4 and DH-9, plus heavy bombers such as the HB-100s and 400s, plus its own fighter escorts. It carried out day and night bombing over 40 targets in Germany, but not Berlin. But as a foretaste to come, lost many aircraft. But planning to bring into service the massive V-1500 to strike deeper into Germany, including Berlin, did not happen, as the armistice came into being in November 1918, before these raids could happen. As a point of note, the Great War did not officially end until 1919 with the signing of the various treaties, including that of Versailles. In the next episode, we shall look at the period between the wars and the very early signs of indiscriminate terror bombing, such as Guernica in the Spanish Civil War and the cities in China.